This presentation was originally given at the Jasig Sakai conference in Atlanta, and we are happy to again bring it to a wider audience here online via Unicon's webinar. One of the running jokes at Jasig this year was talking about authentication and web single sign-on for 10 years now, and if you haven't already deployed CAS and/or Shibboleth, please go do that. But many folks in the community are very anxious to move on to some more pressing problems. And I think authorization and attributes is one of those problems. And so it was really fun to partner with Kevin to work on this particular project, which I think starts to go down that road by baking in attribute-based access control directly in the CAS server. So showing us potential path for solving some authorization strategies, enterprise authorization strategies. So, okay, so without further ado, Kevin, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great, Bill. Thank you very much. I guess to start out, as Bill mentioned back in the spring, he asked us over here at Fordham whether we'd like to co-present some of the interesting work that we did with Bill and his team. So basically, we settled on the attribute-based access control extensions that we did to CAS. And you might hear me say role-based access control because that's how we refer to it internally. So when we originally gave the talk back in Atlanta in June, there seemed to be almost as much interest in how we got there, what our environment looked like beforehand, and why we were doing this. So in order to kick off, why don't we just take a look at historically where Fordham was before I even joined the university. So Fordham's evolving identity and access management history. Back in 2007, actually probably early 2007, the university decided that it was going to embark upon some enterprise resource planning initiative. And they selected Banner. They also selected Luminous as an integrated portal that meshes well with Banner. They're both products from SunGard Higher Education, which is now called Ellucian. And as part of that architectural strategy, the university also selected the Sun Identity Manager to use for its identity management solution. Then, probably just after the summer of 2008, we launched the university portal. I mentioned Luminous, and it was probably right before I joined the university in the fall of 2008. So I don't know a lot about the history beforehand, but I can talk to moving forward. And let's just talk about what we did in 2008. When we launched Luminous, Luminous is pretty much a package that out of the box, you customize it, you name it. Our portal is my.fordham.edu. So some of the customizations that we did was we added the Sun IDM links on the logon page so that it looked integrated, even though it was separate. And we integrated with Banner so that the accounts that were created in Banner, any new people that join the university, whether they be applicants, students, alumni, whatever, would actively synchronize right into the Sun IDM system. Then the Luminous portal would authenticate against the Sun IDM LDAP, and once it got the authentication success, what it also did was it replicated that information into its own LDAP. It stored the password and used that for some of the more specialized single sign-on processing that it did. So there was a lot of effort expended with integrating the Luminous portal and the links from the Luminous portal with a number of the other non-integrated applications that the university had in place, including, let's say, financial aid systems and course management and other things like that. That was what happened in the 2008 timeframe. So moving right along, in 2009, we decided that the Sun IDM wasn't really where we wanted to be strategically. There were things that were changing in the university, things that were changing in the industry. So we actually started moving away from the Sun identity management software and actually leveraging some of the Luminous account claiming. Luminous has some functionality built in that we didn't take advantage of when we first rolled it out. But you can claim an account, you can provision accounts into Luminous through a message broker. So we were moving along with that, and on the same track, we were also looking to put out to pasture the Sun IDM LDAP and try to leverage the Luminous LDAP. And the approach that we took was to take the Luminous LDAP, which had all the information and more that the Sun LDAP had, and basically, rather than interfere with the portal LDAP, what we decided to do was we were going to replicate the LDAP information. So we embarked upon that, and my director actually gave us the direction to do a partial replication and basically kind of separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So we were focused on what information that we need for identity management, even for role-based identity management. We embarked upon that using the Sun One directory server, which was the only package that we could use that would integrate well with Luminous, the legacy Luminous. And unfortunately, we found out a little bit after the fact, after plugging away at it for a bit and leveraging some of the subject matter experts, we found out that the Sun One LDAP doesn't replicate in a partial manner. The previous version of the Sun One LDAP, back when I think it was called either the Netscape LDAP or iPlanet, I think it was able to do a partial replication, so you could replicate just pieces of the overall LDAP information base, but the Sun One didn't. So we had to do a full replication, but along the way we also extended it, and we extended it to include some of the EduPerson attributes that are used with the EduPerson schema from Internet 2. So moving into 2010, we made a huge leap, and we actually decided to move forward with the Jasig CAS, and that's what we're here to talk about today. So we decided that was how we were going to single sign on, because there were some things happening that year. First thing that was happening was the SunGuard Luminous Portal version 4 that we had was being replaced by version 5. And the platform was changing from a uPortal code base to a LifeRay code base. So it was our impression that this was an opportunity to move forward with CAS to use that as our central authentication vehicle. So moving ahead with that, we got in touch with Unicon, being the subject matter expert in the CAS space, and we asked for their assistance in the installation and some of the integration that we had on our plate that year. And that was very successful. We were able to install CAS on our different environments, and we were able to move forward pretty aggressively, launching CAS with basically a pilot to an application called OrgSync. And OrgSync is a student activities or a student clubs portal that basically supplements our main university portal. So that worked out real well. We limited our exposure with that because OrgSync wasn't very well known at the time. They were launching that as a separate application as well. So we paired that up and we were in the CAS game. And then shortly thereafter, we really jumped in when we decided to migrate the students from the legacy email package that we had into Gmail, so that we had Gmail and Google Apps for the future. So we integrated that, used the CAS extension to integrate with Gmail because Gmail is more SAML-based authentication and authorization. So we worked with Unicon on that. We successfully launched the Gmail. So that was the tail end of 2011. In 2012, our architectural decisions as far as our portal led us to embark upon checking out some attribute-based authentication and authorization. So what we were going to do and what we did was CAS is central authentication. So when you get into CAS, you are authenticating the user. But that doesn't help us too much with authorizing the user to use certain applications. And we had a need to do that going forward. So that's a quick overview of our history. That pretty much sets the foundation for what we're going to talk about. So let's talk about why we made the decision. The business drivers. So as I mentioned before, Lucian was actually rolling out their new Luminous portal, Luminous 5, and Luminous 4 is now on the docket to be sunset. So we have to be able to move across, and the Luminous 4 was very, very integrated. Not a lot of flexibility, and that kind of limited our potential in using the portal for a lot of things that our user community wanted. And so as we were evaluating Luminous 5, Luminous 5 is LifeRay based, and I won't go into what that means, but suffice to say it's a different technical code base than the Luminous 4. So we had an opportunity to evaluate where we were and where we want to go, and we weren't quite sure whether we wanted to jump into the Luminous 5 boat. Luminous 5 was delayed a number of different times. It's very hard to get some clear information as to where the future is for Luminous 5 and who's adopting it. So it didn't seem very strategic for us. What we decided to embark upon is creating our own hybrid portal, and we wanted to see where that would go. So instead of getting locked into an out-of-the-box portal, what we were considering at the time was, hey, we've got some public web content, we've got some secure public web content, we've got our traditional portal content, which is very closely integrated with the Banner Enterprise Resource Planning tool, which is basically a system of record for the university. So our internet services team kicked around how would we want to see our future look. So as we were building out the hybrid portal design, we decided that we needed to have something a little bit beyond the CAS authentication functionality that it does. So we approached Unicon as far as kicking around the idea, what can we do with CAS so that we can better lock down some of the content that we don't want certain roles or certain persons to have a look at, and extend authorization to those who are allowed to see the content. And so that's where we were at the beginning of this year. So to give you rather than me just talking to this as I have the last few slides, let me give you a bit of a look at what we're dealing with. Right now on the screen in front of you is a bit of a screenshot of the Fordham Enterprise Portal. And this is how Luminous Portal looks. You get to customize the banner up at the top and some of the colors. But basically it's a tabbed metaphor design. And what you're seeing in front of you is the faculty tab, which shows a bunch of channels or portlets that are accessible to the person in that role. So the faculty role can see things like faculty registration, faculty advisor tools, some campus resources, which are mostly public web content. They can help students register, and so on. So without taking you through really the detail there, that's what we were dealing with. So moving forward, this is a prototype of how we envision our future portal to look, and we're still working through this right now. The future portal is actually much more web content based as opposed to, I guess, traditional application based. And we put this together as a prototype. It's got a number of different features. It tries to leverage the legacy content, but one of the exciting new features that we're looking forward to is this is a responsive design. For those of you who haven't heard about responsive web pages or responsive websites, basically what responsive means is that the same content, the same design will be able to auto size depending on the device that the person is using to view it. So in the case of a desktop or a laptop with a good sized screen, it'll look like this pretty much. However, if you take this down a notch in size, let's say you're viewing it on an iPad or a Galaxy Tab or something like that, since it has a smaller screen space, it will actually rearrange some of the content so that it fits better on that screen size. And then if you take it down one more notch to, let's say, a smartphone, an iPhone screen or one of the similar Android smartphones, it'll actually take it down considerably more, but it'll still be functional and it'll still use the same content. It'll just present it in a somewhat modified view. Basically, this was what we're looking at, and as you can see, the faculty tab is still there, but what we were looking to do is lock this down by role or by attribute. So let's move forward with that and see what that means. So here's a summary. Basically, we were looking at a hybrid model. The content is going to be public secured and dynamically secured sources. And the dynamic secured sources is basically stuff that is content that's being pulled out of Banner. And an example of that would be if our student goes on to the new portal and wants to view his or her course information, wants to see what their course load is, or wants to check out their registration status or whatever. And that information is sourced from our Banner ERP. So we're looking to use CAS for the authentication method, and then we're going to lock down the secured content using attribute-based access, where we would define that in a configuration as we would roll out new content. And the dynamic content would be additionally checked for some of that dynamic content that we're getting from Banner. Banner also has fine-grain level authorization, so we kind of have double lockdown from an authorization standpoint when we get to the Banner code. All right, so again, for some visuals, here's an example of some public content. And this public content is just a screenshot of an alumni events page. So they pull down a pull-down menu from the home page and select alumni events, and you get a list of alumni events with a calendar and some selection methods. The reason why I show you this is to contrast it with some private content. So the alumni events are on a database. It's in IIS. So we have a few people that are in our alumni relations department that are able to enter new alumni events, delete events, administer the events. And when they do that, when they try to go to a private page, in this example, they're going to get the typical IIS user ID and password dialog box. And they need to log on using that, and that'll get them to the next page, which allows them to modify the content for that private content, that database-driven content. We'll show how we see this moving forward. So that same link now instead will bring up our CAS logon page, which is on the left-hand side of this screen. They still type in the user ID and password, but in this case, instead of a user ID and password that is maintained in the IIS environment, instead what we're going to have is the user ID and password that we use typically throughout the university for accessing all of the secured content that a university member would need. So that means our portal, that means Blackboard, Gmail, and so on, most of which are already integrated through single sign-on. But this is how it would look. And on the right-hand side is the admin menu for adding new events and editing old events that are out there. That just shows how we anticipate using the role-based CAS for locking down the content that we already have. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Bill, who will talk about the technical solution and how that played out. Bill?
Thanks, Kevin. So to start off, talk a little bit about sort of what our design goals and approach were. We wanted to, working with Fordham, we wanted to leverage their installed CAS system to basically extend it into sort of some authorization functionality. So we wanted that to be as simple as possible. We wanted not to have to fork the CAS server. In other words, we wanted to simply just extend the CAS server so that Fordham could stay on the community distribution. And it needed to be easy to configure. So those were kind of the main things that we wanted to kind of drive at. And to try to achieve those goals, we leveraged the Spring Webflow technology that's used in the login flow for the CAS server that many of you may already be familiar with. Is a great way to add custom behavior to your CAS server in a way that doesn't fork the code base, but allows you to continue to run through the community distribution. We wanted to leverage person registry, which is a component also from Jasig that CAS uses to get attributes. And then finally, we implemented a JSON-based services registry, and this was to enhance basically the services registry with some of the authorization data needed to implement this solution. So we'll go into all these things. So this is a state diagram kind of showing at sort of what's this alternate behavior or flow that we implemented on top of the CAS server. And, kind of starting from the left there, the beginning of the login flow, you would try to generate a service ticket this presuming the user was already authenticated. And what we've added is this service authorization action, which gets access to all the attributes that are configured via that person directory. And then there's an easy way to sort of figure out whether that person's authorized or not based on the JSON services configuration. And so if they're not authorized, then the login flow is terminated and the users can be redirected to a unauthorized page. Otherwise, service ticket is generated and they continue via the normal CAS login protocol. So pretty simple here. We really just wanted to bake in this ability to do this authorization decision point right in the CAS service ticket flow. Okay, so this is a little more technical detail of a state diagram showing how we extended some of the core CAS components. This is getting sort of fairly technical, but the main thing is we've leveraged the Spring Webflow. And so at the top of the diagram, you see that abstract action. That's standard Spring API implementing this service authorization action. And the service authorization action basically leverages, the standard CAS API. Okay, so just kind of finishing off this sort of diagram, at the bottom there you see the JSON services registry, and that's where I'm going to show you that we augmented CAS to be able to manage some of this authorization configuration. So if you're familiar with the login flow, this is an XML-based file that defines kind of the behavior of the CAS server, and this is really just showing how we were able to easily insert our authorization action in that login flow. So if you were maintaining a CAS overlay, you would basically maintain a login flow XML file and add these 2 bits in there, one for the service authorization check and one for the unauthorized redirect URL. So one of the more interesting things I think out of this project was the implementation of the service registry in Groovy. And this is a JSON-backed file, but the component that allows us to read this file and understand it was using Groovy, which made it really easy to kind of deal with JSON and get that plugged into the CAS server. And finally, here's an example of the services registry file. And so some folks on the call might be using the JPA-backed or the database-backed services registry, or you're using the web GUI. And that works fairly well, and that's all good. Some folks may be managing their services directly in Spring configuration files, so there's an XML file where you define these. In order to make it both easy to configure and to implement in terms of extending the services registry with this authorization metadata, we decided to go down this path with a JSON file. So this is an example, and you see this sort of a services block and a lot of metadata that you would normally be accustomed to seeing in the services config. And then the stuff in the bold is really the added bits that allows CAS to understand that for the service that we're talking about, in this case we have this test service, which is Google, the authenticated user must also carry eduperson affiliation of current student or alumni. And if they have those affiliations, then the user would be passed back to the service just normally. Otherwise, they would be redirected to the unauthorized redirect URL. So we thought that was a pretty easy and simple way to configure that authorization stuff. So with that, I will hand it back to Kevin.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bill. So I guess the question is, how has this worked out so far for us? I think the short answer is very well. As with most projects, we near source the effort with Unicon in this respect, so we need to at least be diligent about the coordinated handoff from the Unicon consultants as we sought to integrate it into our environment at Fordham. As with anything, there were a couple of little road bumps or speed bumps, but nothing major. Everything worked pretty much as we anticipated. So we won't dwell on just the integration because that's typical with any project. So let's talk about where we've used it so far. So we've piloted the CAS extension in the IIS space. You saw the example of that before, and we implemented that, and that's working real well. We also used it similarly in IIS to integrate out of our portal into a Microsoft Project Server instance, which is actually SharePoint based. And so we used the CAS to wrap around an authorization page that then went out and connected through to SharePoint. So that was tricky, but it went very well. Most of our traditional pages are JSP based, Tomcat hosted. So once we had the wrapper set for that, everything went well with that as well. And looking forward, we're actually looking to switch over our content management system for the web. And we anticipate that that's going to bring us much more into the PHP space. When we embark upon that, we'll see what we can do as far as converting it over ourselves. And if we don't, we'll reach back out to Bill and his team and leverage their expertise in working with PHP-based content and CAS. Probably even more interesting is as we build out our new responsive portal that adjusts for the mobile platforms, we're actually building out a lot of the dynamic code base in Grails. So we actually integrated the CAS into the Grails using the Spring Security module that's within the Grails infrastructure that we're using. It's a little tricky at points, but now that it's in, we go out to CAS once to validate that the authorization has taken place, and that once we have the authorization for the particular role, we place that in the Spring Security repository, and then the content from there on doesn't have to always reach out to CAS. So that's worked very well, and that's going to be part of the foundation for moving forward with our new portal platform. So the other thing is what worked well, and did we have any gotchas, any surprises? So pretty much out of the box, when we got the extension for the role base from the Unicon team, the only thing that we really had to rework was really some fine-tuning, because the consultant that worked on this actually didn't have the code integrated with an actual LDAP, pretty much mocked up the interaction with the LDAP. So when we integrated it with our LDAP, we had a couple of issues with firewalls and the like. That was pretty much a gotcha on our side. We didn't anticipate that up front, and once we saw it, we pretty much took care of it pretty quickly. And then, as I mentioned before, the Grails-based framework that we're using for the new portal content, it was a little tricky. You know, we were dealing with a bunch of new environmental tools. My team didn't really have any Grails experience, so we were working with Ellucian and their consulting team, and they had never really worked much with CAS or never really implemented CAS in the Grails environment. So I think it was a learning experience for all of us, but ultimately it worked very well. We're using it moving forward with all the Grails-based code that we're rolling out now and in the future. So it's working real well, and we anticipate leveraging the attribute-based access control as a strategic platform going forward. So all is good in that respect. So I guess Bill and I would like to get some questions from you all, and we'll try to answer them. The IIS, I tell you, most of our plain public website group uses the IIS. My team is pretty much more familiar with the Tomcat and the Apache. We were using IIS, and we had to upgrade it to the ASP.NET. I think it was .NET 3. But the wrapper that we put around the ASP code was pretty straightforward. It was a call out to CAS, and it would do the necessary validation of the authentication and then the authorization, and would return something basically giving the roles that were authorized and whether we were authenticated, and then we could go from there. So the ASP.NET code took that in and then made some decisions as to what it should present back to the requester. We're using a traditional LDAP repository for a lot of our person information. And so the product we're using right now is Sun Directory Server. We're moving forward into using Red Hat Directory Server, and we're piloting that right now. We also use AD for pretty much locking down desktop content and for file access, but underpinning our identity access management is pretty much LDAP based. It was pretty much a server-based code in the ASP. So the ASP is Active Server Program. So that code would actually go out and do a verification call to CAS before it actually presented it from the server back to the web client. And if that didn't pass, the modification that Bill and his team made, basically, once you call it, if it doesn't pass, it actually sends you to an error page or a page that gives explanation as to why it didn't work.
Yeah, so for IIS or the Microsoft platform, Unicon would usually recommend trying out the .NET CAS client, which is one of the clients that the Jasig's project proper supports. So if you're on, relatively new IIS application, then the .NET CAS client should work just fine as a kind of the equivalent to the ModAlf CAS for Apache. So one other quick thing, unless there's other questions. One I thought was one of the more interesting questions at the Jasig discussion was that, I think people understood that we were using attributes or roles, depending on how you're thinking about them, that are maintained in the LDAP directory to provide this coarse-grained access control for services. And the question came up, well, that all sounds really well and good, but how are we managing those roles or attributes to begin with? Currently, the solution that we've implemented for Fordham or with Fordham, doesn't really address that issue at all. Lately, Unicon has been involved in a number of projects with Internet 2 Grouper, which is a great open source groups management toolkit. So I think the answer to that question is, if you don't already have all that worked out, is to take a look at Grouper to see about getting a handle on enterprise group management as part of your enterprise authorization strategy.
And I guess to that point, Bill and I talked a bit about Grouper, but we've got a full plate and more here at Fordham right now in trying to address the new portal and some of the new architecture that we're trying to put in place over the next year and a half. So Grouper is in our vision, but not in our near-term resource planning, unfortunately.
The short answer is that the authorization stuff that we did for Fordham currently isn't on the roadmap for the sort of CAS community release. We triple over this situation lots of times. So all the work that Unicon does on CAS or any of the open source projects, in the SOWs that we write, we always stipulate that source will be open source, because that's our preferred way to go. And that was also true with Fordham. So the code is available. Part of the JSON services registry is already available. That's up in the CAS add-ons that I posted in the chat dialogue there up on GitHub. I was looking around, and it doesn't look like we posted some of these authorization components, but there certainly can be made available. We always work hand in hand with the community projects. And so, sometimes stuff that's on the leading edge, which is where Fordham is with the authorization stuff, it's not always immediately obvious whether or not this is something that the community as a whole is going to have interest in, and it would make sense to sort of bake into the full distribution. So Unicon really relies on sort of the community to help guide us into what makes sense baking back into the community distribution, but certainly something that we're open to doing. So it looks like we are just about out of time. I just wanted to thank everybody, especially Kevin, for joining us and giving a great presentation and allowing Unicon to partner with you on the project. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for everyone for joining us, and please do send us email, or if you have any other thoughts or follow-up questions, we'll do our best to answer those as well. So thank you.